So, good afternoon. My name is Latipa, and I'm zooming to you as a guest on the homelands of the Cahuilla, Tongva, Lusoño, and Serrano peoples. I'm the founder and director of the Memory and Resistance Laboratory, which is a collective initiative to develop radical memory work across media forms for the healing and empowerment of communities. At the Memory and Resistance Laboratory, we are actively working to link geographies of settler colonial occupation from Palestine to California to urge forth a planet where all lands, bodies, and worlds are liberated. I'm pleased to welcome you to this virtual event, Bloodlines, Disillusionment and Return. Can they meet? Gabor Maté in conversation with meital yaniv, an event that is also co-sponsored by the Decolonizing Humanities Initiative at the Center for Ideas in Society at UCR. And if we were in a live space, we would walk through a doorway to enter the event, a kind of entry or threshold into a space. And I want to invite each of you on this webinar to actually place a hand on your heart and a hand on your stomach. And I invite you to close your eyes. I also want to invite you to take 3 breaths of increasing depth. The first breath may be shallow, but just pay attention. The second breath may reach the center of your lungs. And with the third, I want you to make a deep, intentional reach for the bottom of your belly, a breath that fills your body with spaciousness and grace. And I invite you to open your eyes. And with this breath work, I hope we allow ourselves to walk through this threshold with a little bit more presence and groundedness. We have about 1 hour together today. I just want to offer a brief outline of our structure. So our speakers will each be reading brief texts, then enter into conversation with one another. And then we'll open the floor to a question and answer period. And as the event proceeds and questions arise for you, I invite each of you to begin to formulate your question in a succinct way, so that when the time for Q&A arises, you'll have about 1 minute to share your thoughts with all of us. I also want to assert that this is an open and welcoming space for the whole spectrum of possible positions and feelings. All of that is welcome. And the only thing that I ask as the moderator is that you please keep to this 1 minute or so time limit when we are speaking. I also want you to know that you are welcome to avail yourself of the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen, as well as the Q&A function, where you can also drop questions in for the Q&A section by text. So without further ado, I am pleased to introduce our speakers for today. Our first speaker is Gabor Maté, who needs no introduction, but here I go. Gabor Maté is a retired physician, international speaker, and writer whose books have been published in 37 languages, an author most recently of the New York Times and an international bestseller, The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Health in a Toxic Culture. His areas of expertise include child development, trauma, the mind-body unity in health and illness, and addictions. An infant survivor of the Holocaust and a former Zionist youth leader, he is well known for his critique of Israel's policies toward the Palestinians. He lives in Vancouver, British Columbia. Meital Yaniv is learning how to be in a human form. They do things with words and moving and still images, with threads, with bodies in front of bodies, with the earth. They are a death laborer tending to a prayer for the liberation of the land of Palestine and the lands of our bodies. They keep fires and submerge themselves in ocean and seawater often. Yaniv is learning to listen to the waters, bird songs, caretakers, and ancestors as they walk as guests on the home and gathering place of the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luceño, and Serrano. Yaniv is also the author of Bloodlines, which is the first publication produced by the publishing imprint Communities of Memory, which is part of the Memory and Resistance Laboratory. So without further ado, I turn this floor over to Dr. Gabor Maté.
Thank you for all of you for participating. I will begin by a brief reading from my book, The Myth of Normal, which is, the full title is Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. And really the book is about the nature of human beings as bio-psycho-spiritual creatures. In other words, our biology is inseparable from our emotions, our psychology, which is itself inseparable from our social relationships. And of course, there's a spiritual aspect to us. And that's what that book is about. I'm not going to be talking about the book, but I'll be reading from it. And it's from the very last chapter. And it's about disillusionment, which is very much the theme of this conversation, I think, in some ways. So I'll just jump in. If we are to see things as they are, we must be willing, even hungry, to shed our illusions. Commonly, we speak of disillusionment ruefully as an experience to be avoided, akin to disappointment or sense of having been betrayed. And it does carry a cost. We may have to let go of something we've come to value or a perspective we've taken refuge in. What we see less easily is the cost of refusing to be disillusioned. As I often ask people, would you prefer to be illusioned or disillusioned? Would you rather engage with the world as it really is or only as you wish it were? Which approach brings more suffering in the end? And then I talk about my own series of disillusionment, and it begins when I'm 13 years old. I grew up during the period of Stalinist oppression in my homeland, Hungary. Though as an idealistic little communist, I was oblivious to its nature. I recall my heart swelling with pride to be living in a system dedicated to freedom, equality, and the kinship of humankind. At school assemblies, I would leap to my feet on cue, eagerly joining my classmates in rhythmic applause and chants whenever the principal mentioned party or leader. My parents and teachers knew better than to burst my ideological bubble. A careless dissenting word escaping a child's lips could mean harassment, loss of livelihood, even imprisonment. Then one morning in late October 1956, our building shook to the thunder of artillery. A few days of liberty granted by the evanescent triumph of the Hungarian Revolution, uprising against the dictatorship, followed by its swift and bloody suppression, opened my 12-year-old eyes. The Soviet army I had long idolized, the fighting force that has saved my infant life in 1944, early 1945, was suddenly the enemy. Not long after, on a rainy November night, my brother, parents, and I trudged across the muddy Austrian border, leaving behind our life in Hungary forever. That was my first disillusionment. More followed. In the wake of the horrors of the Vietnam War and the unconscionable lies used to justify it, I learned that the American empire, which in my adolescent mind had displaced the Soviet one as the new shining city on the hill, was as cruelly and rapaciously self-centered as its rival. I had to arrive as well at the heart-rending realization that the dream that had been a balm to my soul. And I grew up as an infant, survivor of the Holocaust. I grew up with anti-Semitism in Hungary. And at some point I became a Zionist, which was the antidote to all that. So the dream that I had been a ball to my soul, that of a triumphant Jewish national rebirth in my people's ancestral biblical home, had been achieved by imposing a nightmare on the Palestinian inhabitants of the land, a nightmare that continues to this day. When the truth struck home, I was once again astonished that my imagined universe could have been such a distorted version of the real one. Visiting the West Bank and Gaza, I wept every day for 2 weeks. And that's all I'll end. And I think that'll segue very well into Yaniv's experience. Meital's experience.
Thank you, Gabor. Abandonment is a spilling wound from the untended trauma of persecution. Instead of allowing ourselves to feel abandoned, we feel refused, we feel victimhood, fixating on rejection when we don't want to look at our fear of abandonment. This is our Israeli shape trying to hide itself from us. I am asking you to go to the undercurrent, to the underbelly, to help me get under the occupation. Everything hides there in those decaying roots of fear and truth. Make it die intentionally. Cut the water flow. Discharge the trauma inside our own root system. Pour it within. Before there was a you and me, there was a seed of belonging that got uprooted and hidden. Our limbs forgot the sense of direction. We have been lost in disconnection and loneliness. We forgot to bury the remains of the bodies, and now we follow a scent of something they told us was home. A taste of metal and gunpowder covers our family meals. Breaking connection to satisfy the wall we built to separate ourselves from ourselves. Stop and feel what you will do the day after the occupation, when Palestine is free. Imagine something that doesn't constitute a grave for yourself. Stay in the undercurrent with me and imagine our lives, imagine life, your life, when Palestine is free. Imagining Palestine the day that Palestine is free is not our imagining to do. We have to imagine ourselves listening and following along from the root of our hearts. And for that, we must be able to imagine our life and aliveness the day that Palestine is free. It is our labor to imagine the healing circle we need. It is our duty to liberate ourselves from the shape of the occupier by allowing ourselves to acknowledge the harm we have caused on individual, personal, collective, and familial levels. Miriam Kaba writes, we have also thoroughly internalized these logics of oppression. But if oppression were to end tomorrow, we would be likely to reproduce previous structures. Being intentionally in relation to one another, a part of a collective, helps to not only imagine new worlds, but also to imagine ourselves differently. We must accept the fullness of who we are and tend to all that we do not want to be anymore. Freedom starts in the heart. The mind follows, the body quick to adopt, and spirit is already there. Imagining us being free the day that Palestine is free, not because we bypassed or buried or ignored, but because we actually invested the time and energy and resources in our ability to take full accountability, full responsibility, to change the core of our identity, to help the parts we are letting go die with care, and to call in love, compassion, and wisdom into the new empty parts of our bodies. Remember, the body is always present. We must change ourselves so deeply that shifting power, breaking superiority, and rebalancing will come directly from our hearts, from the parts we took the time and intention to heal in preparation for this day, coming into right relationship with our harm by listening, following the imaginations of the people we have harmed, meeting them in their future imaginative reality with humility, devotion, and grace. When Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu collaborated with others to create the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, they understood that the end of apartheid was not the end of the trauma. There are threads here for us to hold and lean into, but more than all, an understanding of the work we must do now and the work we must continue to dedicate our lives for. It will take generations to truly undo the knots of our bloodlines. As Desmond and Mopatutu clearly offered in the Fourthfold Plan, from pain, one can choose to harm and begin a revenge cycle, or one can choose to heal and begin a forgiveness cycle. We have been stuck in the harm and revenge cycle for so long, we forgot it was a choice. When Jewish freedom fighters rebelled against Nazis in the death camps and ghettos, they rebelled against the banality of evil. The trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted or sadistic, that they were and are still are terribly and terrifyingly normal. From the viewpoint of our legal institution and our moral standards of judgment, this normality was much more terrifying than all the atrocities put together. When Palestinian freedom fighters fight us, they fight for the same reason we did, but we distort their acts of freedom as acts of wanting to annihilate us, when all they are doing is protecting themselves from the monster we have become. We are the ones full of hate, thinking we are at risk, when the reality is that we are placing everyone we come in contact with at risk, including ourselves. Rosa Robota was a freedom fighter operating in Auschwitz concentration camp. As a prisoner in Auschwitz, she organized Alla Granter, Esther Wachblum, and Regina Safasicjan to smuggle small portion of gunpowder that were later used to blow up the crematorium during the Sonderkommando revolt. She and the 3 women who fought with her were tortured and interrogated about their mission. They did not disclose any details and were hung on January 6, 1945. Her last words before being executed in public were, "Take vengeance and be strong." The crematorium explosion caused about 70 Nazi casualties and blew the crematorium roof off. To the soldiers who hung her, Rosa Robata was a terrorist, but to the people, she is a freedom fighter. On May 2nd, 2021, Rahab al-Arub, a 60-year-old Palestinian woman from Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank, was shot and murdered by Israeli soldiers. According to the Israeli army, Rahab al-Arub tried to approach the soldiers at the Gush Etzion junction with a knife in her hand. The soldiers shot and killed her on sight. If indeed she had a knife and was aiming at the soldiers, Rahab al-Arub took her body and the resources in her hands and resisted her occupiers. To the Israeli soldiers, Rahab al-Arub was a terrorist, but to the people, she is a freedom fighter. Nizar Banat was a Palestinian activist resisting the Israeli regime and criticizing the Palestinian Authority complicity. On June 24, 2021, he was dragged from his bedroom in Hebron, arrested, and placed in a car heading towards the Palestinian Authority Preventative Security Center. He was pronounced dead on arrival. An initial autopsy showed he was bitten on the head, chest, neck, legs, and hands, and died from unnatural causes. His unusual death at the hands of the Palestinian authorities has resulted in a multitude of protests all over the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority has asked to purchase gas canisters and stun grenades from the Israeli army state to quell the Palestinian protests, and Israel has agreed to sell and train. To the joint mission of these forces, Nizar Banat was a terrorist, but to the people, he is a freedom fighter. One people's freedom fighter, another people's terrorist, another people's catalyst. A movement was a seed, was an intention to imagine differently. The hours of labor in the years between the uprisings, the people that commit to the path, to a new way, to try and die on our own terms, the privilege of dying from old age alone. We all die believing something someone else thinks is wrong or unworthy or a waste of time. We all die knowing something to be right, to be decent, to be worth the fight, even if we gave up, even if we took our own life. Death can be an exit wound, and it can be a rebirth, an offering and a taking with our last breath, tied hands with a gun to our head, free hands holding a gun to someone else's head, a bullet that takes a life from a life that gave up on taking and is offering themselves whole and broken and done. I too shall die, in your hands or in my hands, and I wish to die with hands free to enact a purpose, tied to nothing but service to life. The edge of water, the generosity of the tides, showing themselves to us over and over again in devoted repetition, an endless cyclical movement of a body of water, a circle, coming and going, backward and forward. Whether we come or go, pay attention or ignore, Mother Ocean moves in the same tide for us, for her, for life. May we die for life, for the freedom of us participating in life, in service of life. May we love each other as an act of service for the benefit of all beings everywhere. Thank you.
So, what is the procedure now?
We can talk a little bit and then open it to question when you feel ready.
All right. Well, first of all, for you, you're letting go of your identity was a very embodied process. Like for me, it was more emotional and ideological. At a certain point, I just found out that what I believed wasn't true. And then I had to deal with the mixed emotions that come with disillusionment. But you're more body connected than I am, it seems to me, reading your book and also speaking with you a couple of times. So tell me about your body relationship to this whole thing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, my body, I think, was the first part of me that said no.
Yeah.
And it was, I wish at that time, I wish that wasn't the case. Like I wanted to resist my own body. And my body really left me no choice because of the panic attacks that I had while serving in the IDF. And yeah, so I think because there was such an intense no that led to me disgracefully leaving the army, it felt like because of that, I then had to like piece all the pieces of why. So like it started in the body, and then I had to really educate myself in first of all, like what is actually happening that I am unable to see but can feel. And then what is my responsibility in this? And now how have I been a part of it? Knowingly, unknowingly, seen, unseen. So I think it was like the body and then the like educational part. And in that educational part, also like continuously tending to my nervous system, because every piece of information till today is a whole experience of undoing and reshaping and releasing and letting it die and bringing in something else. And it's like a continuous tapestry that I am weaving as I shed.
So speaking of the body, it's somewhere in Bloodlines, your book, you say that, I'm trying to remember the exact phrase, but your induction into the Israeli army began at conception. Mm-hmm. And you take on the body, the armor of the soldier. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I really feel that the indoctrination of the trauma of why I have to have this armor on me was given to me in the womb, in like the pieces that created this being. And as soon as I left my mother's body, I really feel like a uniform got stitched on me. And I say that because, you know, like we talk about soldiers in the IDF, they're children. I mean, most of them, like that, the people who maintain this force are children. And in order to indoctrinate an entire society of people, you really have to start from infancy. It really starts in it's not just in the family, it's not just in school, it's like the whole thing is saturated to offer us two things. One is fear and a deep unresolved feeling of victimhood, and the other part is like, what do we do to like fight it? And what do we do to fight it is become this like IDF, Israeli identity, strong, heroic, all of that. So it's really
and ruthless.
you know, and ruthless, yeah. So like, you know, to really like achieve that, when I see photos from Gaza right now, and I know like I have cousins who are in Gaza right now as soldiers, when I know what they are doing, what they are seeing, in order for them not to see it, that is not training that you do in a year. It's a lifetime. It's from infancy.
Which brings me to my next point. Because of that sense of victimhood and historical traumatization, when Israel gets criticized, there's such a defensive response on the part of so many people. I mean, I've been speaking on this issue for a long time, but because of the recent events, that's been magnified. And I get so many messages of pure contempt. And I'll never trust you again. You were my hero, and I'll never trust you again. You broke my heart. You betrayed us. You're a terrorist. You're a Hamas sympathizer. And I know where that comes from. It comes from a deep sense of betrayal, because the unresolved sense of victimhood and fear is still driving people's consciousness. Now, I don't have relatives in Israel, and I don't have any close. I know people there and have students and so on, but some of them are really disappointed in me right now. What's it like for you, and how do you handle it? I mean, some of the people that you know in Israel surely must be aware of your stance and what you've written and what you said publicly. What do you get, and how do you handle it?
Yeah, I'm very much in that learning process of how to handle it.
Yeah.
I think I think, you know, like given my specific upbringing, the specific lineages and caretakers and elders that I come from and with, um, I really feel like that is the only thing that is unique about my experience, is that like I swam, walked, drowned, stumbled
Yeah.
here, and I really remember each part of it. And it's not done either. It's going to be like, oh, maybe a few more lifetimes to really undo this.
Yeah.
But from that place, I feel like because of that, in this moment, and I know you say something similarly, like I must speak,
Yeah.
like this positionality, it's not really about me anymore. It's like I must speak because I really see the spectrum from in the best way that I can. And yeah, I mean, this is not the first cycle that I will lose loved ones because of this. This is probably the most public cycle that
Yeah.
I've entered.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I make a lot of prayers,
Yeah.
and I try to catch my breath, and I am held by my loved ones and by the communities I'm a part of, and the movements I'm a part of. And also I'm scared.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I totally understand. In my book, The Myth and Normal, there's a chapter called The Traumatic Tension Between tragic tension between authenticity and attachment. In other words,
Mm-hmm.
this happens in a lot of families where kids, if they're themselves, they get a sense of rejection from their family. So in order to belong, to be attached, they give up their sense of self. And then we bring that into our rest of our lives. And if I'm honest with myself, it's not that it doesn't hurt to be seen that way. It does. It causes a pain. On some days, I'm not so together and spiritually realize that I can just brush it off, you know. But it's a decision we all have to make of which pain would you rather have? The pain of suppressing yourself and not speaking your truth in the face of what is a massive war crime and injustice that's been going on for 75 years now, not speak out, or the pain of losing some people's esteem or affection, you know, and it's a matter of having to choose our pain, really. Which pain would we rather have? I want to put a question to you that I hesitated a little bit, but you encouraged me to be totally forthright. This is not a question from me, but it's somebody put on my website. And the question is disingenuous, I think. But your answer may be illuminating. So here it is, okay? You're openly queer, you know, you're gay and so on. And somebody wrote, well, there she goes, you know, if she was in Palestinian society that she's defending, she would be under attack. And it's true. In Palestinian society, for women especially, and I've seen this, to be queer is to invite rejection, violence, and even possibly death. And here you are standing up for Palestinian society and freedom. So how do you square those two? I mean, I'm sure you're aware of what I'm talking about. What's your answer to that?
Yeah. First of all, before I even go in that, I just want to also say that the way that as a queer non-binary person, the way that I feel free within, let's say, Tel Aviv in so-called Israel, that is also a part of propaganda. There's been pinkwashing for decades now where Israel is trying to present itself as like this like queer loving haven for queer folks to come. And that is a part of the propaganda machine. So, you know, I am not fighting for the Palestinian society. I'm fighting for Palestinian liberation. I'm fighting for the Palestinian self-determination. I'm fighting for the land of Palestine.
Yeah.
I'm not fighting for an ideology. I'm not fighting for a religion. I am fighting from a place of, I'm not even fighting. I am standing up to say that I have been wrong in what I was believing and doing and participating in, because I understand that that entity, that Israeli identity entity, has been participating in a genocidal attack on the land of Palestine against Palestinians, whether they're Muslims or Christians or atheists, for 75 years, if not more. So from that place, as a queer body, I get to imagine otherwise, because I've had to imagine my family otherwise, because I've had to imagine my freedom otherwise. And from that place, you know, many things that heteronormativity offers us are also part of different propagandas and brainwashed things that we don't stop and think. So as a queer body, I also had the privilege, I see it, some might not see it that way, of undoing a lot of that to live the life, to have a chosen family. And as queer bodies, it's really something that we depend on. So from that place, I also offer, you know, a philosopher that I love very much, Bayo Akomolafe, says, queer is the undoing. So I offer that queering of the situation to not so see it in a binary of like, well, you're fighting for people who hate you. I'm not fighting for the people who hate me. I'm fighting for them to decide if they want to hate me or love me or whatever they want, but to do it in their own liberation and freedom.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just a final question for you. It's impossible to speak it against what Israel does without being accused of self-hating, being a self-hating Jew or an anti-Semite if you're not Jewish, bashing Israel, holding Israel to a higher standard, all this kind of stuff. But your book really ends with a love letter to Israel, doesn't it? So can you talk about that, of loving and censuring at the same time?
Yeah. So in the book ends with a love letter to the Israeli heart, and then a death prayer to the Israeli identity. And like there are parts of my being that only get nurtured when I'm on that land. And when I'm in those waters, when I walk on that earth, where I'm in that humidity, in that ecosystem. And there is so much about the way that I was raised that I love. There is so much about the way that I get, a part of Shorish, this organization that I'm a part of, which is a US-based anti-Zionist organization. We talk here about anti-Zionism, and we come with that passion and the love that we have, and I have been needing that for so long because it's a different kind of way. So when I say a death to the Israeli identity, I really mean like the identity that has merged Israelism with Zionism to becoming conqueror, colonizer, occupier, ethnic cleanser, genocidal machine. But then in our hearts, I really believe in our hearts. I believe that there's freedom there. And, like the self-hating Jew part, it's interesting to me when it comes up, because first of all, I was not really raised Jewish. I was raised Israeli. And I'm returning to Jewishness, to both like my Sephardic and Ashkenazi lineages as a healing process. And there's also the element of, I think that it's been now, I don't know, 20 something years since I left the army and started this process. I have learned to love myself deeply in this process. And I mean, I'm returning to your first questions about the body. Like in this process, like I have liberated parts of myself because I've allowed them to die. And I'm learning to love myself in a way that is completely new. So instead of saying that I'm a self-hating Jew, I would say that I'm a self-loving Jew for the first time, maybe.
Thank you. I do wonder if might be time to turn over to the audience if they have any questions, Latipa.
Yes, thank you both. And as I mentioned earlier, you're welcome to raise your hand, and I will be able to call on you and unmute you if you want to ask your question by voice, and also drop a question into the chat. And there's a specific Q&A function where I'm looking for questions for our speakers today. So just to kick us off, there are already some questions in the Q&A function. So I'm going to pose the one asked by Eman Albeda, who asks, how do you see this conflict ending? The vicious cycle of violence will never lead to, quote, liberation, unquote, or sustainable peace.
Is this addressed to someone or?
This is an open question.
Gabor, you want to start?
I can't predict what's going to happen. I think there are any number of possibilities. I don't look forward to anything just or right or satisfying anytime in the near future. I see the Israeli occupation becoming more brutal as it has become even in the last, and I'm not even talking about Gaza, but the West Bank, not that the two could be separated, It's one country, for God's sakes. But it's just become more brutal. Let me tell you guys one little story. This itself is enough to tell you everything that's going on. This is an article from the New York Times, witnessed by an American reporter. A Palestinian village is threatened by settlers in the West Bank. They're saying, we're going to come and hurt you. So the Palestinians evacuate the village. And by the way, 20 Palestinian villages at least have been abandoned because of settler violence since October the 7th. So the settlers come, so the Palestinians leave, the settlers come and savage the village. They just destroy homes, thrash houses. A few days later, the Palestinians come back. Waiting for them is an Israeli occupation officer who says, oh, you can come back, but you can't build. You can't put one stone back in its place. You can't, your roof has been destroyed. You can't put a tarpaulin over it. You can't put a top over your roof. And the Palestinians say, but it's wintertime. It's cold. The rain's going to fall into our living room. Sorry, without a permit, you can't put a tarp on your destroyed living room. Of course, you'll never get the permit. I mean, it might take months if you get it at all. And if you put a tarp on your roof, we can come and bulldoze your home. Now, that's all you need to know. I mean, that story alone tells you everything that's going on. And that's only like the tiniest tip of the iceberg. So I see that getting worse. It may be that the US will force some kind of a phony two-state solution in Israel, where the totally surrounded and suppressed parts of the West Bank can declare some, and maybe part of Gaza can declare some kind of a Palestinian state, so that now the Americans can say, okay, now they have their state. That's the best case scenario, and it's an awful one. In the short term, that's all I see. In the long term, Israel would not be the first colonial power to succeed in completely decimating and suppressing the local population. It happened in North America, it happened in Australia, it happened here in Canada. That could be an outcome. I don't know. But in the long term, what I see is that Israel is digging its grave, because its existence is dependent on two factors. One, the support of the American empire. Well, I got bad news. The American empire will not last forever. It's already on the wane. It's already on the way down significantly. Militarily, it's still the wildest beast on the earth, but its power to control international events is waning, as we can see. Or the American empire might at some point decide that this little state in the Middle East is not to our interest to continue to support. That's potentially conceivable. But either way, that support's going to be gone. The second factor that's keeping Israel afloat is the relative weakness, disunity, and corruption of the Arab political cultures. That may not last forever either. And just what sales is, if the Arabs do become unified and self-aware, if these corrupt and Western client regimes fall, as eventually they will, Israel going to be a very small country surrounded by a lot of people that it has completely embittered and alienated and tormented. So I see in the long term no good outcome. And so I think from the Jewish Israeli point of view, they're digging their own graves. So now, there might be other possibilities, scenarios possible. I don't know. I'm not a prophet. I'm just telling you what I see in the short term and the long term.
Thank you. I feel like I want to make room for other questions too. I think I would just say one more sentence, which is whatever the outcome is, whether you live here or there, there's work to do right now. And that work is about imagining otherwise and getting uncomfortable, getting
Yeah.
uncomfortable with things that as Israelis we will need to give up. But in order to do so, again, it's in our hearts. So I think there's work to do here. And if you live in the US, there's a lot of work to do here. Because as Gabor is saying, or I don't know if you use that words, but the US, the Israel cannot afford the occupation. So one way to stop this is just stopping the support.
Well, of course, we're not doing this work if we're totally pessimistic. We must believe on some level that raising our voices and raising consciousness, that eventually is going to have some kind of impact. And for sure. Okay, Latipa, anything else?
Yes, so let's turn to a question from Adi Gelb, which is directed toward either of you. Most people are dropping their questions into the Q&A, so that's why we're doing it like this. So Gelb says, I've struggled so much with communicating with my parents since becoming more and more anti-Zionist as a teen, but it has been exacerbated since October 7th, and we can barely talk. They are liberal and supportive of me as a queer person, but their lack of empathy toward Palestinians and overall callousness toward them deeply, deeply wounds me. How do I move forward? How do I reach them?
You can't. Give up trying. Grieve it. Just have the grief of having lost. Now, you could love your parents, you could respect them, honor them, whatever your relationship is, but you're going to have to grieve the fact that they can't understand you because they're too stuck in their trauma. And the harder you try, the more they're going to resist. So now, if that leaves you unable to speak with them at all, then you're going to have to grieve the loss of that relationship. If you can speak with them and not badger them with your views on this, just accept that they're limited, traumatized people stuck in a vortex of multi-generational historical trauma. They're afraid, and that their inability to hear you comes out of fear. Just see them as frightened people who can't shed their illusions because their illusions give them a sense of safety. So it's your call whether you want to keep trying or not. But I'd say give up any agenda that you're going to change them. Just give it up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I needed to hear that too. And I would add to that yeah, it makes me think about what Gabor was saying also about authenticity versus attachment. And there's also, I think, a place, an island in the middle where you cannot agree, but you choose to be in relation, whatever that means to you, if you want that. And sometimes it's impossible because it feels like it's against your own integrity. Um, so yeah, I feel for you.
When I first spoke publicly about this issue was in 1967, right after the war, where by which time I saw very clearly that this war was fought very deliberately by Israel to capture territory, and they're never going to give it back. I said this in 1967. My parents kicked me out of the house. My father eventually came around, and no, I didn't stay out of the house for long, but a difference of opinion remained. My father eventually came around and saw what I'd been talking about. My mother, whose parents had been martyred in Auschwitz, could never really forgive or let go that her son had betrayed her people. No, she loved me. It's just an issue we never talked about. But she could never, or maybe she forgave me, but she could never contemplate that I might be right. So that's just an issue that we stayed away from.
So I want to offer this question from Solomon Mikonin. Solomon writes, queer Palestinians exist despite the real rejection and violence. I know queer Palestinians who are accepted by their loved ones. I want to raise to either of the speakers that we have to imagine the issue of queerness being more nuanced than a generalized homophobic Palestinians.
Well, I'm sure there's all kinds of nuances and variabilities. So I'm sure that what you said is totally true. At the same time, I can tell you, when I was in the occupied territories last year, I went there to help provide workshops for women tortured in Israeli jails. And that was very necessary. But when people came to me afterwards for private counseling, Palestinian women, very often it was about their position as women in Palestinian society or queerness that wasn't accepted and so on. So, it's like any society. And the problem, of course, is that in the context of occupation, it's so difficult to fight that struggle because the major struggle to fight is against the occupation. And in how many directions can you spread your energies? So these people that were caught in that dilemma of how do I fight for my gender liberation when I'm fighting this brutal occupation? And I need to have as my allies people that may not like my gender identification. I don't know, Meital, you may have a much more nuanced perspective on this than I do, but I'm just telling you what I saw when I was there.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I would say that there are queer people everywhere, always have been, always will be. My queerness was also not accepted. It took a lot of time. Um, and and yes, we need all the nuance. We need all the nuance. It's I'm coming back to what I read, like going into the undercurrent, right? Like there's like the world of surface and facts and binaries, and then there's the undercurrent of roots and mycelium and waterways and imagination. And I think again, as queer people, when we are not being indoctrinated into pinkwashing, um, and into like rainbow flags that mean nothing. There's an actual undoing that can be done, and yeah, I don't feel that it's my positionality to talk about queerness within Palestine because I don't have that experience. But I invite if someone in the audience wants to bring that in.
Thank you, Latifa. There's a question in the chat that I'd like to address, if I may.
Absolutely.
Okay. It's from Paula, and Paula says, in the face of unremitting efforts to annihilate the Jewish culture, what would you have Israel do? Paula, I used to believe as you do. I used to be a Zionist youth leader. I studied nothing but Zionist texts for years. I saw it exactly the way you see it. So I don't reject you saying what you're saying, but I do want you to question the possibility that maybe your perspective is not reality. Just consider that possibility. I'm not aware of any unremitting efforts to annihilate Jewish culture. I'm aware of all kinds of efforts to resist the occupation. But you tell me something. In 1903, there was the Sixth Zionist Convention. Maybe you know this, Paula, maybe you don't. 1903. We're talking 120 years ago. The British at that time offered Uganda to the Zionist movement. And the founder of the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, wanted to accept it. He wanted to create a Jewish state in Uganda. Now, this was rejected by most of the Zionists who, for all kinds of obvious reasons, wanted to establish their state in Palestine. But let's assume for a minute that Herzl had won and the Jewish state and the Jews migrated to Uganda. And they declared, as the Zionist movement did in 1920, that our aim, I'm quoting directly from Dr. Ader, a Zionist leader, who said, our aim in as short a time as possible is to make Uganda as Jewish as America is American and England is English. They said this about Palestine. How would the Ugandans feel about that? Furthermore, how would the Ugandans feel if the Zionist leaders like Ben Gurion and Vladimir Jabotinsky and others said, these Ugandans who are fighting against us are not terrorists, they're just people defending their land, just like we would. So we have to use even more force against them. How would the Ugandans feel about the Jews? And then how would it happen that in 1948 then, the Jews, I'm putting that in quotation marks, because I don't identify Jews with Zionists, established their state by expelling and massacring large numbers of Ugandans, which if you don't know happened, you just don't know history. I can name you 7 Israeli historians at least who have documented the massacres and rapes of Palestinians by the Jewish armies in 1948, the destruction of over 500 Palestinian villages, the deliberate expulsion, brutal expulsion of the population. And one of the Zionist historians, still active, who documented this, says the problem was we didn't expel enough of them. How would then the Ugandans feel about, quote unquote, the Jews? And then if for 75 years, the Jews, quote unquote, started taking more and more land and suppressing more and more Palestinians, as they're doing right now in the West Bank. If you don't know that, you're just not reading the news. Read Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper. It'll tell you. And then Ugandans fought back. Would you accuse them of trying to annihilate Jewish culture? Well, who created that dichotomy? This is being done in the name of the Jews. How would the Jews look to the Ugandans? So look, I'm only trying to say that the Palestinian, now, let me tell you one more thing. Meital mentioned the Jewish resistance to the Nazis. The most famous and the most heroic and the most inspiring act of Jewish resistance was the rebellion in the Warsaw Ghetto. When out of 500,000 people, only 50,000 were left. And some of those 50,000 said, if we're going to die, we're going to die on our feet with guns in our hands. And we're going to take some of them with us. The second in command of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising was a man called Marek Edelman, who did escape the Warsaw Ghetto and became a cardiologist. And he was a lifelong supporter of the Palestinian resistance. He said that today's Palestinians, today's resistance is the Palestinians. He did not support suicide bombings. He criticized severely the killing of innocent civilians. But the resistance to what had been done in the name of Jewish culture, which is to say the suppression, expulsion, and continued oppression of these people, he totally criticized. And that's all Meital and I are doing. I don't see any attempt to annihilate Jewish culture. I see people desperately trying to maintain their own existence in the face of themselves being threatened with their national annihilation. Now, does that justify acts of violence against civilians? No, it doesn't. But for God's sakes, there's a context here. I don't feel threatened as a Jew. I do not feel threatened as a Jew. And I'm not afraid that anybody's trying to annihilate me. And furthermore, and finally, I know this has been a long little tirade, if you like, but finally, what do you think supports anti-Semitism in the world? The whole world is watching while one of the world's strongest military powers, which is Israel, is massacring thousands of Palestinian children. Infants, newborns are dying in their cribs, in their incubators, because they cut off the electricity. And the whole world is watching this. And it's being done in the name of the Jews. How do you think the Jews look to the world? What do you think really is threatening Jewish existence? So I'm saying to you, rethink it. Look at the Israeli historians. Read the Israeli reporters who document the oppression of the Palestinians, and then talk about who's trying to annihilate who. That's my response to you, Paula. You're not going to accept this. You're going to think I'm a self-hating Jew, all that kind of stuff. I can't help it. The evidence is there. I used to believe just what you believe. And I'm sorry if I cause you discomfort.
We have time for one more question. I'd like to turn to Monica Hansen, who has their hand raised, and I'm actually going to allow you to talk, Monica, and you can ask your question using your voice.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Awesome. Well, first, I just want to say thank you to both of you, meital and Dr. Gabor. I am a Palestinian American. I do what I can here, knowing the role that the U.S. plays in this conflict, to educate my friends, my neighbors, to advocate on behalf of Palestinians through my legislators and our president. I think I'm doing something just about every single day, and that includes my Israeli and Jewish friends, many of whom I've had very personal, intimate discussions with, and some of them are on that verge of sort of on that abyss where either for the sake of our friendship, we probably have to stop. And I wonder if, like another question before about someone's parents, if I should just drop it, and if I want to maintain that friendship, just sort of leave it where it is, or both of you having been on your own journeys of that disillusionment, and probably having had different triggers throughout your life that led you to that disillusionment, if you would have any advice for me, not being a Jew and not appreciating fully or being able to understand fully your perspective and that journey that you went through, have advice that I could pass on or share with some of my Jewish and Israeli friends who don't see things in the same way as we've been talking about here today.
Meital, you want to take that one?
I think there's something really powerful about friendships. There's something I think for me that is a little bit more difficult with family, because of just the attachment and the way that families are. But with friendships, I feel like there's first of all the possibility to take a pause. Like the fact that you as a Palestinian are here asking me for advice on how to speak to your Israeli friends, that is a blessing to hear. So thank you for wanting to engage in that way. I think coming back to what Gabor said, like it's either you see it or you don't. And when you start seeing it, you start seeing it. And if they don't see it and they keep you in the like factual place, I have found that there's nothing I can say here on the surface that will make anyone listen. It's usually triggers someone to a place where they don't listen at all. So what I do is really like lean into the relationship and lean into the connection and lean into the love and then speak, you know, with one of my best friends after the first time that I was in Hebron, which in Hebron, in the occupied West Bank, there's a street, Shehuda Street, that is an apartheid street, meaning only Jewish Israeli people can walk on it. There's Palestinians building in the street. Their doors are welded. They've been born there. This is their land. The doors are welded. There's actually a photo of a porch of a Palestinian home that I took that is on my desk. And I look at it every day because there's a family inside that home that their door is welded and their windows are covered like a cage of metal because stones are being thrown at them all day long by Israelis and soldiers. So when I came back from that experience, I sat with one of my best friends who is Israeli and does not think like me. And I just shared how that made me feel without telling her what she should feel or what I expect her to feel. I was just like, this is what I did today, and this is how it sits in my body. And from that place, I was able to lean into the relationship and the connection and open a crack because it was through my experience. So my advice, if I can even give advice, it's to just like come lean back to the relationship, lean back to where the love is, and speak about like your heartbreak right now, which I'm sure is beyond words.
I would only add very briefly, and coming back to Paula, when you hear Meital talking about the street where the Palestinians in their own town cannot walk, but Jews can. When you hear about that New York Times report about a Palestinian not being able to put a tarp on the living room, which has been destroyed by settlers, how do you feel? Does that make you feel anything whatsoever? Or are you too defended to even feel anything? How do you feel when you hear those stories? And if there's anything in you that hurts your heart about hearing such stories, and we could tell you a million such stories, are you willing to explore what's behind it? That's all. How do you feel? And if you don't feel anything, maybe you want to ask yourself, why not? And until you ask those questions, all the facts that we throw at you, all the history, all the historians that I could cite, all the Jewish soldiers who describe what they did and what they're doing right now, and all the Israeli journalists who report on it, none of that is going to mean anything to you. It won't. Because for some reason, your heart is closed against knowing that side of things. And I don't blame you for that. It comes out of fear. But fear is not a great political advisor, let me tell you.
Thank you both. I appreciate your responses. That's very helpful in meital in particular.
I know I speak on behalf of every attendee, I think, on this webinar to express gratitude to meital Yaniv and Dr. Gabor Maté for the wisdom that you've shared with us today. I am dropping a link in the chat where you can get a copy of this book, Bloodlines, if you haven't already. And I would just like for all of us to, well, first of all, before I try to lead us toward a closure of sorts, meital, Gabor, do you have anything you'd like to share?
Only that nothing, I'm not even sure it's, but may be necessary to say it, which itself is a sign of something. Nothing that I have said, and I'm sure nothing that meital has said, undercuts, denies the validity um, of the pain and fear and trauma that people experienced after October the 7th. Nothing undermines any of that. We're talking about human pain here, not just Palestinians or just Jewish pain. It's human pain. At the same time, that event did not happen in a vacuum. It was a culmination of a long history. That doesn't make it right. But unless we want to, if we want to move forward to any kind of a peace, we have to understand the history. And those of you that don't know it, it's there for you. You can find out. That's all.
I think I would add to that as a closing place that if you did feel a lot of grief and are still maybe mourning and grieving what happened within so-called Israel on October the 7th, but you are not grieving in the same way or in a similar way or at all about what is happening every day in Gaza and what is happening every day in the West Bank and what is happening every day within so-called Israel to Palestinians with Israeli identity, with Israeli IDs. If you're not able to grieve that, if you're not able to grieve the fact that every 10 minutes a child in Gaza is murdered, then I would really, really ask you to go to the undercurrent and ask yourself, why can't I feel it? And in that question, in that not knowing, I promise you, there's liberation for you.
I'd like for us to close our time together in the same way that we entered this space, with breath. So I again invite you to close your eyes if you'd like to, and just focus on how your body is feeling. Ask your body if it feels any space, any grace after having just experienced this hour together, and to end with a collective, intentional breath that links us to each other, and that is a reminder of the ways in which we are all interrelated.